You're listening to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, aimed at helping photographers learn how to make the leap from amateur to pro. Hello, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, a joint effort brought to you by PhotoFocus and Skip Cohen University. This is Shamira Young, and I'm joined by my co-host who's dealing with the frigid 50-degree weather in Florida right now, Skip Cohen.
Bone chilling.
Skip. You get no
Bone
sympathy
chilling,
from me.
seriously. I mean, it's hysterical because it's the way we dress down here. Like today, I've got on shorts, flip-flops, and a flannel shirt.
Oh, my goodness.
It makes no sense. And if the fashion police came by, most of us would be arrested. So
That is...
let's get into today's program because you and our guest are both hanging out in a very cold place in the country right now when it's perfectly appropriate to do a hot podcast. How's that?
That sounds great because it is 12 degrees right now where I am in Michigan, so we need to heat things up.
And I'll do my best to not complain about having to put the top up. Okay? Hey, seriously, Riley Arthur joins us today, and she is a testimonial to a combination of the grapevine and social media. And here's the fun aspect of how I got to know Riley. A good buddy of mine in Boston sent me an IM and a link to her work and said, hey, you need to go talk to her. So a phone call later, that opened the door to this Michigan-based documentary photographer. She's an art director. She's an accomplished author. She's a big believer, especially in theme projects like her Diners of New York, which is a personal favorite of hers. And I happen to love the images, too. If you've lived in the New Jersey, New York area, then you know that diners are just an incredible concept. She's a National Geographic Explorer. She's a Fulbright Fellow, and her work has been published in numerous magazines and is in the permanent collections of 7 different museums. Now, I know there's probably nothing Riley can't photograph, but as a journalist, what I love most about her work is it's just about the simplicity of life. And sometimes, obviously, more complex and less simple. In any event, Riley, if I haven't screwed up something in technology here, welcome to the Mind Your Own Business podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to have you here. And I'm outnumbered today because I'm always complaining about the weather or making Shamira aware that she's in the coldest place in the country right now. And now the two of you can share that misery while I complain.
It's nice to have some company, let me tell you. And Riley, I'm so excited to chat with you because it sounds like you've had a very interesting journey. And we were kind of chatting in the pre-interview chat, and it was interesting to learn that you are not originally from Michigan, but from, now let me say this right, American Samoa, correct?
Yes. Correct.
So,
born and raised.
Oh, and somehow you ended up here in Michigan where we're just happy to be in the double digits today. And so let's kick things off by having you kind of tell us about your background, how you ended up doing what you're doing today, and just how you got here.
Well, since you mentioned where I was born and raised, American Samoa, I think that would be a great place to start off. Mm-hmm. So you guys might know American Samoa from a number of things like, American football players to, a variety of other cultural touch points. But, the first person to make American Samoa on the mainstream was the anthropologist Margaret Mead and some of her photographs and writings about American Samoa. So, and independent Samoa. So, when I was young, American Samoa, as I told Shamira earlier, is the 3rd wettest place in the world. It gets a tremendous amount of rain. And one of the things that happens is that mold grows on just about anything, including photographs and VHS tapes, back when people were using those. So we had a system where we would take photographs, when our film was ready, we'd send it off to get in the mail to get back in the day, and we'd get our photographs back. My mom would fill a photo album, and then she'd send it off to our grandparents to store, because if we kept them on island, they would mold in a number of years. We'd have no relics of our family history. Wow. So I became kind of fascinated by sort of documenting a place in time, and the fact that where we were from, we couldn't really keep our photographs if we wanted them to actually survive more than, say, 3 years. So that sort of drive to document is really becoming kind of a leading charge in my sort of fascination with documenting things and being sort of a photographer that picks niche interests that might be sort of going away. So that's sort of a long answer to your short question. How I got started in my career was I had my sort of senior thesis in my undergraduate degree. I interned at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival as a theater photographer. And then as soon as that internship was over, I was actually hired by sort of my college job. I worked at a gift shop, and they hired me as a product photographer right out of college. I think I was making the lofty salary of, $13 an hour or something ridiculous. But I was lucky to kind of start from there. And I was always photographing my own personal projects along the way. And it was sort of from that basis that I sort of launched myself into a career as a photographer.
Wow. I want to hit on a topic that you just hit in there just now. Just share your opinion on the importance of personal projects, because it's a topic that comes up regularly on all of the podcasts that Shamir and I co-host, especially in a pandemic where so many people would have been lost without some kind of special project. What are some of the ingredients that you've looked at that say, wow, this is going to be a fun one, I need to do this?
Well, first of all, when I think of a personal project, I like to do, I have a background in photojournalism, and I do an extensive amount of research. So I see who has documented this before, what other photographers can I look at their work and see, maybe contact them and ask them about it. Or if nothing has been done, maybe I need to dig deeper in this. That's not to say if someone hasn't documented something, there isn't more room for exploration, but I tend to go for sort of niche projects that people haven't. And from there, I usually just kind of jump in. And as the project continues to evolve, I do more research. And I usually like to take oral histories as well. Writing and some degree of sort of background information and research is very important in my work.
So one of the things, this is so interesting. One of the things I'm curious about, can you talk about the challenges of being a journalist, especially today? And, we haven't had very many journalists on the show. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to hear your take on it, especially given the current state of things after coming off of 2020 and now we're here in 2021. Talk about the challenges of being a journalist regarding health issues, the pandemic, physical distancing, even just building trust as you're taking these images with people.
Yeah, so right now is a particularly challenging time for any photojournalist or journalist at large. Things like gaining access into people's homes, whether you're masked or even photographing people who are not masked. There are, different sort of rules of ethics on things that you can do in normal times, but some of the rules haven't even really been written now, depending on what publication you work for. So you have to be extraordinarily careful. You have to wear and provide PPE if you're doing, an editorial shoot and there's multiple people on set. It becomes very challenging to keep it safe. And then, a lot of photojournalists are freelance and work for themselves. So then, you probably have to make sure that you have the proper insurance and things like that in place so that you aren't being compromised. Now, additionally, in terms of sort of bridging the personal project and photojournalism sphere, which often some of these stories dissect, it's extremely challenging right now to get funding for different projects. And also, right now, a lot of the projects that are being published have to have sort of a social justice angle. And if you're photographing something a little bit more niche or a smaller story, it might not get as much coverage. So you have to kind of pick and choose those kinds of stories if you really want it to get exposure. Now, and additionally, a challenge that photojournalists have been facing in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is every year there are less jobs. So in the last 3 years, 73% of journalism jobs have disappeared.
What? Wow.
Now,
Wow.
art departments are hit first. So that is 73% of journalism jobs across the board. Photographers, photo staff, art directors, things like that, those are the first to go. And there isn't adequate statistics into how many of those are being cut. So, if you are in J school and you're trying to be a photojournalist, you really need to be aware that staff jobs are going away and that kind of security, people are on, freelance or contract, and there's just not that security. So you have to have a sense of ingenuity to be able to thrive as a photojournalist today.
It's interesting because I'm being the old guy here. I'm going back into sometime in the 80s when Sears let go of all their in-house photographers, and in the commercial world, it was a monstrous idea because they let go of their photographic department and everything. Everybody went outside. They were looking for freelancers, and this was the Sears catalog that had been photographed for years. And then if you take it a step further, who was it? Was it the New York Post? They got rid of their photographers and gave all their reporters cell phones?
It was the Sun-Times at first, but yes.
Okay.
New York Post, several followed, and it was shocking. It was in 2003 the Chicago Sun-Times laid off their 28-person full-time photo staff and just said, here's a phone, go and take photos. And I think it was like the iPhone 6 or something, not the best quality phone. And they just shoved it in the hands of their writers and said, now you're also a photojournalist.
Well, it's a little scary when technology goes that way. I mean, that's the extreme of the pendulum swinging absolutely the wrong way, because just because you're a great writer and a reporter doesn't mean you understand any of the concepts in lighting and composition and exposure, and you put all those together. And there was an amazing decline over the next year, and then the pendulum started to swing back more. But that also kind of makes this the perfect time for me to ask you about a new book that you've got coming out very shortly about how to take better pictures with your cell phone. Where did that all come from?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out March 16th. It's called Phone Photography for Everybody, iPhone Photojournalism Techniques. And it was based on sort of realizing this trend in the industry and wanting to teach iPhone photojournalism to everybody, to regular writers, to students, to people who might otherwise not have those skills, because they're now all asked to be a jack of all trade, and that's not fair because they're not necessarily given the proper training. So this book came about from wanting to provide that.
And where can people go to learn more about your book?
Well, I have it on my website, but you can also currently pre-order it on Amazon, and it'll be in bookstores everywhere March 16th.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to include a link to that in the show notes, because I think that is very, very timely. And it's very cool that you're putting out a resource that is reflecting our changing times and, frankly, a need that needs to be filled. Learning how to take better photos with your iPhone. So that's very cool. Very cool.
Thank you.
And, one thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier, you mentioned that it's important that you be, what is the word? Use the word ingenuity is involved when you want to be a journalist today, especially given the fewer staff jobs out there. And so I'm curious about the subject of relationship building. I think relationship building is more important than ever, especially as more and more journalists are freelance. And you have to go out and build relationships with these other businesses, entities, people. And so I'd like to talk about your National Geographic relationship and how you started that, how you fostered that. How did you get that off the ground?
Well, that's actually a really great introduction to the question, because the way that came about was actually an introduction to somebody. I was photographing the Mountain Film Festival in Telluride, Colorado, and it's a outdoor and environmental focused film festival. And a friend of mine who worked the festival introduced me to the head of grants at National Geographic and said, "You've got a great project. You're doing this amazing Fulbright project, and you probably need more funding. You need to meet her." And so I met her and sort of fumbled through an elevator pitch of the project, and she said, "Okay, great, apply." And so I did, and I got it. And it was great because the project that I was doing in Slovenia for my Fulbright, I did need additional funding because I required 6 different translators for various languages in the Balkans, and that funding went a really long way. And then after that project, I came back and I presented it at National Geographic. I was able to get published on their blog, their Explorers blog. It was a project documenting a group of people who were basically made stateless when Slovenia became independent from Yugoslavia. And at the time that the project was complete in 2013, the wide American public wasn't that interested in stateless people, in refugee right, and things like that. And so I got it published a few places, but not as much as if I did it today, now that people are aware of these sort of global crisis problems, which, is fine. I just wish that I could have gotten more for the people that I sort of documented and wanted to see through. But after presenting at National Geographic, I was then invited, after meeting some of the people that work there, to apply and be a part of their National Geographic student expeditions, which is one of their expedition programs. It's photography workshops for students in the summer, sort of like a rich kid summer camp, which is basically what it is. And so I led a photo expedition with these students in London and Prague. And so from there, that's sort of how my National Geographic relationship sort of started.
Okay, so you're teaching, you're leading a group of students on a global overseas photo walk.
Yep.
What are some of the key points that you try and get your students to remember?
The interesting thing about high school students today is that they have a wealth of resources at their disposal, like YouTube and social media. And so the range of sort of skill levels was very variable, because we had people who, were very skilled photographers, and then we had people who sort of didn't even know how to use anything other than auto. They were given a nice camera, but they didn't know how to use it. So when you have such a varying skill set, you really have to kind of start at the basics and then scale from there. And then, give certain students more due attention than others. But we would come up with different assignments for the day. We'd do a lecture in the morning, and then we'd, go out in the day, and then we'd come back and share our photos and so on. So a lot went into it, including at the end of the program. We'd host an exhibit in a gallery in London, in Prague, and have an opening, and the kids were required to help promote it. So we'd print flyers, and then they'd have to kind of go out and get people to come to it, which was also a really good exercise in, what they'll need to do as professional photographers in exhibits. And so it was a really good program for them. And then, of course, they could then say on their college application that they'd been through this program, and they had some training from a National Geographic photographer, and sometimes I would write them letters of recommendation.
Boy, great stuff. Mary Ellen Mark, the late great Mary Ellen Mark, told me once that when she was teaching, and I've mentioned this on a couple of podcasts over the last few years, when she was teaching, she would insist that her photographers cover up the screen on their camera. And the reason for that is, and she loved shooting film. I mean, she was shooting analog right up until she passed away. She wanted her students to understand that the problem with digital is that you get the shot, you look at your camera, you chimp, and you move on. Mm-hmm. When, as a true journalist, and that was her style, she wanted them to wait. She didn't want them to know whether or not they got the shot. And and you use it in reference to a wedding photographer, for example. That tear in Grandma's eye might not have happened yet, but you got the shot of Grandma and her granddaughter, the bride, and you walked away when the real image that was going to just kick butt was coming 10 seconds later, a minute later. But she wanted her students to stay with the story. And I mean, that's one of the things that I love about when I look at a lot of your diner images. You're telling a story with multiple images about that diner, and we're learning a little bit about the people, and we're learning about the diner itself, and then there are all these stereotypes that I love about diners, and it is part of storytelling. And I don't know why that seems so important to me to throw in there, but
no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, when I teach, one of the things that I really like to teach, especially beginners, when I'm doing workshops and things, is environmental portraits and the courage it takes to kind of go up to somebody in their own element and get into their space and really accurately document that moment, because it does take a lot of bravery for young photographers.
So, Riley, since we're on the subject of approaching people and asking to document them, to take their photos, which can be uncomfortable and a challenge. And I've heard horror stories of photographers who go about it wrong when they're out in the field and they start snapping photos of someone that doesn't want their image to be taken, and then an argument ensues, or just like really nasty situations. What tips do you have for those who kind of want to get their feet wet with photojournalism, but don't know how to go out and approach a stranger and start to build trust with them enough to take their image? What would you tell them as a starting point?
You have to be exceedingly perceptive and polite. Mm-hmm. I find that there are really two types of photojournalists or documentary photographers, and those are the ones that try to be sly and try to take photos when they think no one's paying attention. Mm-hmm. You can get away with that on a cell phone because, frankly, everyone has their phone out all the time, and they could be texting, they could be doing a number of things. But if you're doing it with DSLR or a film camera or a medium format or anything other than a phone, basically, people aren't stupid. So you have to be respectful and understand that if you're taking their photo, they're going to know. And so it takes just as much effort to ask their permission as it does to try to get away with it. And so, being respectful and, speaking with them, generally people are nice and welcoming. Now, if they have young children, you do have to be extra cautious and careful because they might be protective and not want you to photograph their underage children. And that is certainly understandable.
Yes.
So, yeah. So those are the fine lines there. I will say, if you do end up speaking with them, you can get a much more layered portrait, but you can also get more context. You can get their name, potentially their age, a little bit of background about why they are there in that space. And that will add a lot of layers to your photograph that you might not have had before if you don't know their background. So it always is worth trying. Now, you could get refused, and then, then it's a gamble about whether or not you want to try to get away with it, like I said. I will say I have made a lot of friends just by meeting people on the street and photographing them. In the case of diners, which we keep bringing up, photographing the diner owners and befriending them. And, generally people are nice. So you just have to be nice too and be respectful of their space, not shove a camera in their face and expect them to like it. That's not really going to work anywhere. Mm-hmm.
Well, you hit on one of my favorites again that I want to go back to. It's just a real easy question. Why diners?
So when I was living in New York, I lived close to a diner in Astoria, Queens called Neptune Diner, which kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. Basically, it's a diner that has the 70s faux rock decor, and I lived a block away from it, and every day I'd pass it on my way to the train, and it's one of those things where when you move to a neighborhood, something is so magical, and then after a while it just becomes scenery because it's like, well, it's this diner, it's here. And that's sort of what began to happen. And then I sort of became aware of the fact that in New York City, diners were closing at a very rapid pace due to a lot of causes, but mostly gentrification. So I thought, well, maybe I should photograph some of the oldest diners, the most historically relevant or architecturally unique, because many of them do look very unique. And so I went to, again, back to my practice, which is, let me research who else is photographing diners and let's see what's been done. And, I don't want to copy anyone's idea. And of course, there's a handful of aged diner aficionados who've been, photographing diners all over the U.S., mostly with film photography over the years, but no one had extensively photographed New York City diners. So I had one of those "it might as well be me" moments. And thus began my foray into photographing diners.
Love it.
Wow.
And hard to believe that no one had really extensively done that yet, because that sounds like it would be such rich, interesting content and material.
Yeah, well, there's a couple challenges there. So first, how you define diners is widely contested in the diner circle. There is a 20th century definition of diner, which is sort of a prefab factory-made building, the traditional diners. However, diners today can be a number of things by my definition, which would just be, a more standard restaurant. But a diner, a diner when you see it. In the case of a city like New York City, you have storefront diners, for example. Well, some people. So in terms of even defining diner, it becomes a challenge. And then how there wasn't a database, so I had to kind of research which diners to go to and so on. And there wasn't a database, so I first attempted it by looking at the New York City Health Inspector list, and I came up with a list of 215 diners, and I thought, holy moly, what have I gotten myself into? That's a lot of diners. But then I realized that was only restaurants with the name diner in their title, which excluded about half of them.
Wow.
So, depending on which, definition you go on by diner, by my account, I photographed over 400 diners, 80 of which have closed in the last 5 years that I've photographed.
Oh my goodness. Which makes your images all the more valuable, really. I mean, that's history.
You're right. And unfortunately, the project is becoming more and more prescient because with COVID-19, more diners closed last year than have ever before. And, the strain on small businesses is more so than ever. So basically, this project becomes more relevant every single year. And I almost hate to say that that's true, but it is.
Here's the difference between us. I would have looked at every diner and look at their menus first to see what I was going to order to test them. You're looking at the quality of the diner and whether or not they really are a diner. But I would have been going after either the banana cream or the lemon meringue pie, which is a diner standard. That would have defined whether or not they're really a diner.
The menu is something I look at, Skip. So I look at the menu, whether or not they serve breakfast all day or if they're open 24 hours or late night, whether or not they have booth seating, counter seating. There's a few variables that I define a diner by. Not all of them will have this. In the case of New York City, there's a couple diners that just have counter seating and are very small. But yeah, I mean, the menu is very important to what defines a diner.
This is such a fun project as I look at it, because it's about people. It's about the fact that all of us are foodies. It's about a certain loyalty. I mean, people that have a regular diner they go to are very, very loyal to that. There are stories from smaller restaurants that would fit the diner criteria that you're using, even though they might not be called diners down here, that had problems when the pandemic hit, and how communities have supported, those diners as best they can with carryout, to try and help them, because they are small business owners, they are involved in the community, and nobody wants to see them disappear. So it's a very, very cool project.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
And I'm over here getting hungry when you mentioned banana cream pie. Skip, thanks.
Yeah, well.
Oh, well, we're actually coming up towards the end of our interview. It's amazing how fast these go. But I want to get in a question about, just to kind of change subjects a little bit, the challenges of getting published. I'd like to hit this because I think it's something that a lot of photographers and creative artists are interested in, but don't know how to go about. And so, Riley, especially with you coming out with another book, a new book coming out in March that we talked about earlier, can you briefly hit on some of the challenges that you faced while getting published and how you overcame those?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the way that this book deal came about was actually I was pitching the Diners book, and the publisher Amherst Media Publishing that published my iPhone book, they said, we don't do traditional photo books, we do more how-to guidebooks, but we like you and we like your work and we believe in you, and how about a book along this topic? And so it was a strange thing where, just having a quality portfolio and sort of experience in writing and being published elsewhere really got me to the finish line to get this book. It wasn't the book that I originally intended to, and I still am trying to get my Diners book published. But it's an interesting example of the fact that, if you're open to opportunities and if you have the right interests, you can sort of pivot and get a different book published. Now, in terms of getting a book published, here's what it takes. So if you have a book idea and a project, you need to have a substantial amount or the entire project completed to really get a book deal. Then you need to write a pretty elaborate book proposal. And the book proposal has to cover things like how many pages the book will be, how it's organized in chapters, different competition and other books like it on the market and how they did. And you compile this book proposal. Then you have to do your research and see which publishers would be a good fit. Who's publishing books like this or within this genre. In my case, I picked the wrong one, but they liked me enough that it worked out. So then you submit them. So that's if you want to do it the traditional way with either a small, photo book imprint or a mass market publisher. Now, if you wanted to self-publish, there's a different approach that you would take. And I think Skip would probably be a little bit more qualified than I to kind of walk through those steps.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick, because I don't want to turn this into Skip's experience in self-publishing, but the first book I did with Don Blair was a portrait lighting guide that was meant to be spiral bound. And again, this is pre-digital now, so it was meant to go in a photographer's camera bag, and it was what to do with glasses, and what do you do when your bride isn't a size 5, and tall grooms and short brides. And we also did short grooms and tall brides. So it was everything to do with Mother Nature's challenges. We self-published it through Marathon Press, but the challenge with self-publishing is that you lose the ability to distribute. Now, in our case, every time Don Blair taught a program at Imaging USA or WPPI, he had a booth. We always had the books on sale there, and the book did extremely well. But the challenge for most people, especially today, you don't have right now, for example, there are no live shows. There is no booth to walk by and hear Don Blair or somebody like Don Blair talking about their book. And when Don passed away, the book has continued to do well. Sales trickle in here and there. But the biggest challenge when you self-publish is how are you going to get it out there? But there's one quality you left off, whether you self-publish or you work with a publisher. Once you let the word out, you're doing the book, it is an incredible commitment. So it's not just, and I'm not trying to minimize anything you said, Riley, because you need to decide how many pictures and how many words and how many pages, and you're going to be working with an editor that's going to challenge everything that you've written that goes along with that, and there's so many different aspects to it. But to me, the biggest one is that once you say go, then whether you're self-publishing and you've let the word out or you're working with a publisher, you've got to stay true to that project. You can't walk away. You can't wake up in the morning and go, oh, it's a crappy day. I don't feel like working on the book today, because you've got a deadline approaching. And there's so many photographers out there who I know have had this idea to do a book and then not backed away from the idea, but backed away until they were really ready. Because it does take a huge commitment, and you're putting aside your time. And the fact that you got an outline together that somebody, especially at a publisher, approved, that's only the first step. Now you got to deliver.
Absolutely. And I wrote this book during the pandemic. So, there was certainly a lot of other distractions and challenges along with that, including, photographing for the book during the pandemic, writing the book during the pandemic, and it being winter during part of that time. But I actually went the opposite approach, Skip, because it was my first, traditional publisher book, not self-published book. I actually didn't tell too many people because I was almost worried that I wouldn't be able to do it. So I didn't actually tell too many people until it was out. I was too afraid.
No, but that's another approach to it, and it's really a good one, because then you know that you're working at your pace. It's kind of like everybody that has a New Year's resolution and says, I'm going to lose 20 pounds this year. And a month later, somebody says, hey, how you doing? Did you lose any? Nobody ever says, you don't look like you paid attention to your own resolution. Hey, we're really out of time, but it's our podcast, so we can set the rules. We've got one last favorite question we always ask. What advice would you give a new photographer just starting out today?
That's a great question, and I guess, can I answer it in two ways?
You can answer it in 5 ways.
Okay.
That's anything you want.
Okay. So I would like to answer it first in what I would recommend a student photographer. And that would be to take advantage of every opportunity available to you while you're a student. Things like conference discounts, where you can go to something like Adobe Max for $100, where it's usually $1,300 for working professionals. Do that. Exhibition fees are much lower. Access to teachers and professors and professionals, they're going to be a lot more open to students than they are to photographers who might be their competition. So really try to maximize, propose internships to companies that have never had one before. Just really maximize your experience while you're a student, because once you've graduated, those kind of start to fade away. Now, the recommendation I would have for photographers, working professionals, would be, don't be afraid to pitch. Obviously, I'm a photojournalist, so it's in my nature. But if you have a photography project that is exceptional and unique, put together a little pitch and send it out. Send it out to magazines, send it out to blogs, try to get it published. Now, today, one of the other challenges of being a photojournalist is that a lot of publications, even big ones, don't have budget. So they might want to publish your photo essay, but they don't want to pay you for it. So you're going to kind of have to pick and choose what's worth it to you. But I would say just get it out there, because if it's good, other people will think it's good, but they won't. Don't assume that they'll find you.
Great advice.
Love it. It's practical. It's actionable advice. I mean, this whole interview has just been, it's been awesome, Riley. This is really cool. And I do want to make sure and ask one of our most important questions. Where can folks find you online to get in touch with you?
Yep, I'm easily Googleable. So you can find me on my website, RileyArthur.com. You can buy my book on pre-order on Amazon, and you can follow my Diners project on Instagram at Diners of NYC.
Excellent. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes. And Skip, where can folks find you?
I always say the same thing, and it's always the same. Everything I write is at skipcohenuniversity.com, and I'm Skip Cohen on Twitter and Skip Cohen on Facebook. And I always give everybody my email address, which is skip@MEI and the number 500.com, because we want feedback. And if there are ideas of topics or guests you'd like to suggest, just send us an email. And Shamara, as I always ask again, where are they going to find you?
They can send me an email at shamira@photofocus.com. That's my first name, CHAMIRA @photofocus.com. We love getting questions, ideas, feedback, because that shapes how we move forward with the show. And we are all in this together in 2021, challenges and all. We're going to make this the best year ever. So, a big part of that is the guests that we have on the show, the amazing guests. And Riley, you are amazing. This was just fantastic.
Good stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And we want to thank our listeners for joining us as well. Please tell your friends about this podcast, especially if they want to improve their photography business in 2021, 2022, and beyond. We look forward to having you all with us next time on the Mind Your Own Business podcast, brought to you by Photo Focus and Skip Cohen University.